Hi and welcome to Rossi Audio again. In today's topic and video, I'm going to talk about mismatching and making the wrong decisions and picking the wrong audio equipment. Um, what you want to do when you set up a system, doesn't matter what it is, and we're strictly talking about two-channel here now. I'm not going to get into the multi-channel or home theater setups because uh, one, I'm not into that right now and haven't been for many years. I don't really see the point of it, and before I was, but this is strictly from a two-channel view and a two-channel setup. That means you have a receiver or an amp with a preamp or so on. I don't care if it's a $1,000 system or $500 system or a $200 system or maybe even more than $1,000. This kind of goes hand in hand, regardless of price, regardless of brand, regardless of what type of equipment you have. Um, the biggest mistake a lot of people do is that they don't sit down before they go to the step of buying this equipment, and sometimes they buy things on an impulse, which can be good if you get a good bargain and a good deal on some things, and if the seller is selling a complete setup that is already matched and have a good interaction and functions really good together, then you can do that and get away with a really good system and a setup. But if you are starting from scratch, let's say you have nothing, maybe you have a CD player from old days, or you have a DVD player you want to use as a signal source. How do you go about picking up the right systems, the right products, the right amps, the right speakers, and so on and so on and so on? Well, it depends on what you want the system to do. I mean, if this is a living room system and you just want to have some kind of a setup that just gives you some background music while you do stuff, or you can sit down every now and then and do a little bit of critical listening, or you just want to sit down and do some recreational listening. Well, find out what kind of speakers will fit with your room. I'm not going to go so far and say that some speakers are too big or too small for a room, like so many people or some people do on YouTube, because I don't basically agree with that. You can get big speakers to sound wonderful in small to medium rooms. It all depends on how you use the volume knob and certain other factors. So when people on YouTube say, oh, if you have a 40 square feet room, this speaker is too big, or if you have a 20 square feet room, it's bullshit. You can get big speakers and use in those smaller rooms without a big problem or a hassle or it being too big. This room I'm in now is not that big, and I use it as my little listening room where I can be away from the everyday living space, so I don't take up a lot of footprint or square footage in the main living room. I have a system in there too, where I have a single pair of speakers, a receiver, and a DVD player, and that's what I use in there. And it's kind of okay for that use. If you have a dedicated listening room, or you want to use some type of space in the basement in your house, where you have a little bit, maybe a little bit more square footage, just think about this. It doesn't matter what room you are in. You have to do the same kind of like preparation before you go out. Sit down, look at your room, and think about the usage that you want it to fill. How are you going to use the equipment, and how do you want it to work in that room? And then you can sit down and go like, okay, for this room or for my needs or for what I wanted to do, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I need, and then you start looking for those products based on that. that is the correct way to do things. And then of course you have another side of it. You go with your heart, and this is what you want, and you don't think about the room, and you just go out and buy stuff, and that's one way of doing it. But you're gonna end up getting mismatched. And when I say mismatched, most of the time it is not people choosing too big of a speaker or too powerful of an amplifier. In most cases, they're finding an amp that's underpowering. They're finding speakers that are too small. Remember, smaller the speakers are and the less powerful an amp is, the more you have to kind of use the volume knob, and it can start to sound stressed out. Think of it as cars. If you have a 4-cylinder, 1.6 liter, and you drive this one on the, let's say on the highway or an autobahn or something like that, to get up to 125 miles an hour, if it goes that far or high or fast, you have to use the gas pedal pretty damn hard, and you have to use the gears to get up there, and it's not running smoothly or anything like that. It's running on high RPMs and all that stuff. If you have a 6-cylinder or a V8 or something like that, you can reach the same speeds without that aggressive use of the gas pedal, and the engine sounds more relaxed. And this is the same thing that happens to sound systems in big rooms or medium rooms or small rooms. If you're going to follow the advice that a lot of people on YouTube are giving you, which is false advice of choosing the right speaker according to the room, and they only base it on size, then that's wrong. There's so many other variables that comes in and plays a role. So the worst thing you can do is choosing too small of a speaker and too small of an amp. And a combination of two small speakers and a small amp is the worst combination. Small speakers, a big amp is a little bit better. Big speakers, small amps is bad. So never ever trust anyone that says 12, if you have a 3-way speaker with 12-inch woofer, and if you have 35 square feet of room, that speaker is too big. It's not. It's how you use the volume knob, how you have acoustically worked on your room, and how you set things up in the room itself. So there's a lot of things, but I'm not going to get into that in the deep way. But you can choose to have a powerful big amplifier. And when I say powerful big amplifier, it's not about the physical size of the amp itself, but the more wattage you get and the more powerful amp you get, the bigger the amp will become in size. So when I say big powerful amp, to me that's 250 watts per channel and up. Anything below that is medium sized amp and smaller amps. So from 250 per channel and up is big amps. You can choose a 250 watt per channel amp, a 2-channel amp, and have speakers that are maybe rated for 250 watts, 300 watts, maybe even 400 watts. And you have a pretty good match. It's not a perfect match, but it's a pretty good match. And that will work perfectly in most rooms, even the smallest rooms. And even in the biggest normal sized rooms that normal people have in their houses. So even in a large living room, that will be a good combination, and it matches the room. It also matches smaller rooms. If you want to go smaller than that, you can, but you have to think about what are you sacrificing. By choosing small speakers, the smaller the size of the drivers are, it's going to compromise on the reproduction of the hertz and the frequency and everything, what you hear. A lot of music today has a lot of information all the way down to 20 hertz. The smaller speaker you choose will sacrifice some of the realism in the lower frequency area, and especially below 35 hertz, smaller speakers starts to tend to have a steep roll-off. Most 6.5-inch 2-way or 3-way speakers today roll off around 40 hertz and with 12 to 18 dB per octave. So you will lose a lot of the bottom information in the music, and that is not good, because that way you're not reproducing the music the way it's meant to be. So I always say go up on size on speakers, because it will create more realism in the music and the reproduction. When that is said, how big can you go? I mean, it's only your imagination that sets a limit on how big you can go. I mean, you can find speakers that are pretty big. We're talking about 15 and 18-inch woofers, 3 and 4 ways, huge physical size on the speakers, and so on. And of course, to be able to fit those speakers, you have to have some room. So, you know, cramping it into a little kid's bedroom or something, or a small office, would probably not do the sound any good, because some of these speakers needs to have some room behind them. So that's why you need to look at, well, how big is your room? How do you want to use it? How can you put the speakers in there? You can use big speakers, but use the speakers that doesn't need so much room behind them. So you know right away, if you have a small room, dipolar or electrostatic speakers are out of the question right away, because they're not going to function optimal in our smaller room. They in fact need big living rooms or big basements to function properly. But you can go with big JBL, we're talking some vintage here now. You can go with big JBL speakers, or Altex, or Electro-voice, or Cerwin-Vegas, or Jensen's, Wharfdale. You know, they had some big cabinets back in the day. And you can easily go with those big speakers and have a very small room, and they still sound really good. So that's the things that you need to think about when you decide what you want to use and how you want to use the room with your gear. I have always been of the opinion that you should always pick an amplifier that is at least 50% more powerful than the rating of the speaker. So if you have let's say you have a 300 watt or 400 watt speaker, the absolute minimum I would say you can use on it is like 300 watts and up. Some amps are okay with 250 on those speakers, but if you have a 400 watt speaker, I say start at 300 at minimum, and if you can afford to go up a little bit, at least see if you can find a 500 or a 550, maybe 600 watt amplifier per channel. They are out there, but they cost way more than a 250 watt, 300 watt. So, but always go over what the speaker is rated. I mean, if you have a 400 watt speaker and you choose to run a receiver like this, which is normally somewhere between 25 and 80 watts most of the time, you know, it's not a good match. It's not. Even if you use a power amplifier in the range of 100 watts to 150 watts, it's still not a good match. You're not pulling the capacity of that speaker out of the speaker, and most likely the speaker will sound better as more power you get. The bass will be more responsive, it will be more tighter, it will be more accurate. The tweeters will probably sound less stressed out, because underpowering is the root to all evil and all the problems you can get from a speaker. Blown tweeters, blown subwoofers, mid-ranges, all come from underpowering and overusing the volume knob. Because that's what you have to do when you run an amp that is weak or have less wattage per channel. People tend to use the volume knob to compensate, and sometimes they push the loudness button in if they have a loudness button, and then things starts to happen in a really bad way. So stay away from the loudness button and use your volume knob, but be sure that you have an amplifier that doesn't clip, and doesn't sound stressed, and doesn't get emptied and, you know, just manage to destroy your speakers. Because that's what happens many times, especially if you own big speakers like Altex, JBL, Cerwin-Vega. The bigger models for them, they need power. They need power. So if you don't have an amplifier that is strong enough, more powerful enough, and stuff like that, you are going to run into problems. So that's another part of matching equipment. The most important thing to match in your system, you can look away from like EQs and CD players and turntables and all that stuff, because you can match that on a different level. What you need to match is your speakers and amps, and make sure that those two are as optimal match to each other as possible, and of course that those two are matched to the room. The bigger the room is, the more power you need. So it's just a normal thing. So then you can, when you get the speakers and the amplifiers picked out, and you know that that's a good combination for your use, for your music type, for your room, and you're good to go. Then you can start looking at what kind of turntable do I want, what kind of CD player or DVD player do I want to use EQ, do I want to use some other equipment. Then you can start to add that on, and they are not that critical to match to the amp or the speakers. Sometimes you will hear people say, well, this CD player or DVD player has a little bit warmer sound than that one. If you have a cold sounding amp, then you maybe want to do a warm sounding CD player. If you have a very warm sounding amp, you might want to do a little bit colder sounding CD player or DVD player, because they are out there. There are amps that sounds warmer than others, and CD players that sound warmer than others. One good example of that is Electro from Norway has always had a very, very warm sound, and a lot of people like that. But if you then choose a CD player that also has a very warm sound, it can be too much. If you have a CD player that's kind of like neutral, you're good to go. And cold sounding amplifiers, I have heard those too, and can't really come up with a model number or a brand right now that I can say was really, really cold, but they were more neutral sounding amplifiers. And I remember listening to a Canadian brand called Class A. They used to be Canadian. I'm not sure if they sold or not now, and they had very, very neutral sounding, and some of them was leaning towards the cold side. So they needed to not sound very sterile or very cold or very boring. They needed some equipment on the side that sounded a little bit warmer, that made it sound better as an overall system. But they're awesome amplifiers. Both Class A and Electro Company are really good. So if I was gonna, I've been asked like, well, what kind of equipment do you recommend matching? Well, let's say you either go for Altex, Electro-voice, JBL, or Cerwin-Vega, or Wharfdale, Jensen speakers. And we're talking all vintage stuff here now. They're all good speakers. I can recommend them all. And even the smaller speakers from those brands I can recommend. So if you buy either one of those brands and you match them up with maybe some Class A, Electro Company, Dynamic Precision, Crown, Carver amps, and so on and so on. Hafler has some good amps, and there's some good pro audio PA amplifiers out there that can be used with hi-fi speakers for a very good result. Crown, QSC, Carver, Labgruppen, and some of the older Crest is good. So there's a lot of amps out there, and if you want to go and buy vintage amps, you have Cerwin-Vega has some really powerful good amps, vintage ones. Not the new Cerwin-Vega PA amps, they are trash, not good enough. And so any of those amps, any of those speakers I mentioned, when it comes to turntables, CD players slash DVD players, or other equipment, you can't really go wrong if you pick from the known brands, the good known brands, such as Denon, Pioneer has good stuff, Techniques has good stuff. If you want to get serious about the vinyl, I say look at Techniques and Denon. vintage stuff from them, even new stuff from them is good on that. DVD, CD players, you can always go with Denon, Pioneer, Sony, even some JVC, Teak, you know, they're all good. If you want to do EQs, there's a lot of stuff out there. You really don't need to pay too much attention. Just get something that is fairly nice and good, and that maybe matches your system in a cosmetic way, you know. So yeah, speakers and amplifiers are the heart in your system, and those are the most important things to kind of like work most with before you go out and buy stuff. Like I said, you can buy small speakers, big speakers, medium-sized speakers. It doesn't really matter. If you buy good brands and good speakers, you will get good sound. But as a personal preference, I enjoy the bigger speakers more. I use smaller speakers if I'm in a mood where I'm just going to sit back and have some background music. Then I put on maybe some mid-size or smaller speakers. If I want to play loud and with force, I play with bigger speakers, and that's why most of my speakers are of the bigger size. I don't use a lot of small stuff. I mostly have medium and big sized, because that's where I'm spending most of my time listening to music in. So yeah, just remember, match the speakers and the power amp as good as you can, and always go up in size on both the amp and the speakers. And you don't have to pay that much attention to CD players and DVD players and turntables and EQs and all that stuff right away. Those are the things that you can compromise on. You don't have to I don't want you to compromise on amps and speakers. They need to be of the best quality and the best that you can have and use in your room. So put most money into amps and speakers, and put less money into turntables, CD players, EQs, and whatever. And when you have it all set up and you're ready to go and you have a listening area, then you can start adding on with maybe some lights and maybe an EQ or something like that, and start doing some acoustical works on your walls and stuff like that. But you really don't know before you have put some stuff in and start playing. You don't know before then what are your problems with the acoustics. So put your stuff in and start playing and find out, do I have too much reverb, too much reflecting waves, too much standing waves, you know, all that stuff. And then you can start working on it little bit by little bit, and maybe get some bass traps and some deflectors and absorption and stuff like that. But before you do that, you need to get this sound system in and try it and play on it, so you can hear where the problems are, because not all rooms are equal, so you need to work on that. But yeah, start with your speakers and start with your amp, and that's it. And then after that you can start focusing on turntables, CD players, and EQs. Until next time, Merry Christmas and have a good time.